Yes, we're live. Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to our third Minderful Live of the year. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Nick Pryor from Minderful, our CEO and co-founder, as well as Rosie Viva, who has very kindly joined us today. And we'll do some short intros in a moment. Just before we begin, very sadly, Matthew Bushell, who is our head of partnerships here, who has a diagnosis of bipolar and was due to join today, sadly couldn't make it due to personal reasons at the last moment. And actually, also coincidentally, Mike Lardy, who had also got involved to join us today, also couldn't make it for personal reasons. So it's the three of us, which is brilliant, tripolar, as I often call it. But we've got the whole spectrum covered. We've got myself with bipolar 1 disorder, Rosie as well, I believe, with bipolar 1 disorder, and Dr. Nick with bipolar 2 disorder. So we'll get a whole range of experiences and what's the word, impacts, etc., etc. But we also got Nick as a psychiatrist who'll be able to bring some science to it all. So it's going to be a really fascinating talk. And of course, it's in accordance or in celebration of World Bipolar Day. For those who you are unaware, this was set up by the International Bipolar Foundation in 2014 on the 30th of March, which is Van Gogh's birthday, as in memory of him, who got a diagnosis post his death of bipolar. So without further ado, I'll just give a very quick intro to me, quick intro to you two, and then I'll take you through the plan for the next half an hour or so. I'm James. I'm the co-founder here at Minderful. I'm taking on the sort of creative side of things. Diagnosis of bipolar type 1, set up Minderful with Nick 3 years ago. And what we're really promoting here is a proactive approach to looking after our minds and establishing a wellness routine that works for the individual. Enough about me. Rosie, perhaps a quick hello and introduction.
Hi, my name is Rosie, and I met James in 2020 when I was conducting some interviews to meet other people with bipolar. I am a presenter. I am based in London. I'm 26, and I also curate mental health events as a pastime. And I'm just going to show you because this is where I thought the camera would go to. And that's what wasn't supposed to be there, but it feels really weird having it on an angle.
Brilliant.
But yes, I've got bipolar 1 and I had that diagnosis at age 22. So that was in 2018. And it's really nice to be asked about this because, yeah, I think it's just making that conscious effort to speak about something which is much easier to dust under the rug. So yeah, I've become very passionate about young people hearing about the reality of living with bipolar disorder. And that is what I try and put into a lot of my work.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Thank you, Rosie. Looking forward to our conversation. And Nick, a short intro on you.
Yeah, it's so exciting to talk on this topic. This is so close to what our hearts, both James, myself, and Matthew, kind of leaders in our company, Mindful, all live with bipolar. So, bipolar day is becoming more and more important to us. So, and it's just wonderful to have Rosie come in here and share her story as well, because everyone's experience of bipolar is unique. So we need to kind of learn from each other. I think from my point of view, there's a kind of what I try and bring is a 360-degree view to bipolar. So that comes from my own lived experience of bipolar type 2, seeing my mother live with bipolar type 1, and then working as a doctor, or more specifically as a psychiatrist, and seeing thousands of patients. So, yeah, I'm really excited to see what kind of insights, what kind of ideas, or maybe even tips that we can kind of generate through this conversation that might be of interest to people today.
Great.
Absolutely. I totally agree, Nick. That's the idea behind it. And I think I thought a good place to start. So I know I've titled this Mindful Live through the lens of mania, but actually I think a sort of more appropriate title could be a journey through mania. And so my hope for the next half an hour or so is to take us through that journey of sort of the first diagnosis, that place of stability, which grows slowly into hypomania and then into mania, and then into sort of delusions and psychosis, whatever that might be, and then the sort of back down to stability, or further down, and then the treatment that comes with that, and the sort of recovery process and what we've learned along our way. So really, this is a journey through mania. But Nick, perhaps you kick things off with a slight sort of scientific understanding of bipolar and the difference between, I know we've mentioned it already, the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. and perhaps a bit of context on the sort of the number of people who have bipolar, its genetic disposition, etc., etc.
Yeah, that'd be great. So, so bipolar is, what we would classically call a mood disorder, or sometimes what we would call an affective disorder. And it's important here to just distinguish what the difference is between a mood disorder and just normal fluctuations in mood. So, the best way to illustrate it really is through the difference between climate and the weather. We all have fluctuations in a daily basis in terms of how we're feeling, just like the weather might change from being raining to sunny to cloudy. But actually, a mood disorder is more, we're talking timeframes of at least a couple of weeks, if not months, if not years. So we're thinking more about climate. So you're stuck in a mindset for a sustained period of time. Um, Bipolar type 1 is what most people classically think of as bipolar. So it's when you do go into that manic state, you go so high or your mood becomes so disturbed that you start to have psychotic episodes, you start to become delusional, you might become paranoid, you might have grandiose delusions that you have a relationship or close relationship with Prince Philip, for example. That's what I've had from a couple of patients on the ward before. And there's normally there's a rooting of truth at the beginning. So they might have read an article in the news at some point, but then the way in which it escalates or it amplifies means it gets to the point of becoming a real problem for those people with mania. Bipolar type 2 is different in that it doesn't get to that height where we actually are delusional. It kind of stops where you don't get these really high manias. You just get to really what you would describe as someone who's just basically on turbocharge all the time. They're very restless. They're very overconfident. They're not sleeping very much, but they still have, they're still rooted in reality and what's actually going on around them. Lastly, because I know I can talk too much on this, but the prevalence of bipolar is much higher than people used to think. It's probably around 2 or 3% of the population. And it's important to think of any mental health disorder as a combination of the biological, psychological, and social factors. What's interesting with bipolar is that actually the genetic or the biological propensity of bipolar is very strong. So if you were to separate two identical twins at birth, put one in a totally different environment, say in a different country, in Australia, in a different social kind of level in terms of socioeconomic class, in terms of the support they get from their parents. If you had another person in the complete opposite, if one of them had bipolar, the other one would have a 60% chance of having bipolar. And that level of genetic propensity is higher than most physical health problems. So the genetic element is very strong in bipolar, and that's why looking through family trees can be very interesting for people with bipolar.
Great, thanks, Nick. That really sets the context. And there's a word there that's cropped up, delusional. And from my own experience going up into the mania, I think the question of delusional and what feels incredibly real to you at the time, and I'm sure we'll go into those experiences, and the disconnect between a sort of psychiatrist professional's opinion and other people's opinion versus what you, the individual, are feeling and experiencing is really interesting. But Rosie, how about perhaps a sort of a quick at what stage did you start to realize that you might have been getting this hyper focus or this hyper output? And at what stage did you start to realize that this wasn't necessarily a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where when it happens for the first time, there's no reason why you wouldn't think that it's the truth. And that was the hardest thing to get my head around. But before I go into my story, I just want to say it's also so interesting to hear from a medical point of view again, because I've been out of care for a year now. I had three and a half years support after I was hospitalized. And sometimes it's actually really nice to hear it broken down again into like type 1 and type 2 and mania and hypomania. So yeah, I just even found that very interesting myself, to refresh my memory of what I've got. So I had my first psychotic episode in 2018. And that was a really, really weird year for me, which I think, James, we've spoken about this before, but your life is never the same after something like that. And that's something which at the time I thought was a bad thing. And over the last few years, I've really come around to realizing was such a brilliant thing for me to have a shift in perspective. But 2018 was a weird year because it was the first year where I felt that my depression was getting in the way of my career. So I'd had depression growing up in increments, but I think a lot of teenagers do. And I never saw like a patch of depression which was any worse than any friends, and I could always find a reason as to why it was happening. So I hated school and I was really depressed, and I just thought, okay, great, leave school, depression ends. But in 2018 it was just this huge overwhelming depression and physical anxiety and panic attacks every day, 3 times a day, and I couldn't place in my life what had changed to cause that. So it was a very confusing, really confusing time, especially because I was exercising, eating well, all of this. So I had kind of 8 months or so just battling with what was going on and why I suddenly couldn't even function. And I was put straight on antidepressants by a GP. Unfortunately, instead of seeing the results my friends would have of like slightly less anxious and able to calm down and do therapy, I was just going between these two extremes of hugely elated and saying to friends, oh, I don't have it anymore, I'm cured. And huge sweeping statements saying, you know, I want to take my life, this is unbearable. So the antidepressants were causing me to have these swings rather than any kind of stability. And then I went through a breakup in September 2018, and I think this was the moment where my friends thought, okay, something's weird here, because instead of being really depressed and wanting to see my girlfriends and have a glass of wine and complain about men, I was saying, guys, like, I feel great, I feel so good right now. And all my senses were heightened. And the main thing I realized is like, oh my God, you know, I was having thoughts being like, this is just the most delicious drink I've ever had. Even if it was like an Americano I'd had every day that year, I was like, wow, okay, this is insane. And my eyesight was insane. And these things started happening. But then I think I thought, okay, this is just a normal high, like, you know, fuck them, move on. This is what happens. I'm a single, independent girl. And then it started to become very religious. And I guess no one in my close-knit friends or family knew what bipolar was. So again, this wasn't a red flag. Everyone just thought, what is going on? And I started going to yoga every day and finding like a meditative state, and then thinking that I was connecting to God through this yoga. So I was going every day and doing it for 2 hours and being so still in the postures and holding myself up in like crows and stuff, which I just can't do. And then the thought started that I was on a religious path and that God was about to act through me and the world had to know, which was quite weird because I grew up atheist. So even I was like, this is really weird, but I'm going to run with it, obviously, because I can't say no to God's plan. And great that I'm chosen. God knows why. Like, I didn't do particularly well in religion at school. But it was just this excitement because I knew, as well as I knew my name was Rosie, that God was about to do something through me. So that was what I guess you would now call hypomania, because I was still functioning. I wasn't completely deluded yet. I'd have moments where I'd still think, oh, you know, that's a bit silly. But then the week before I was sectioned, it went full blown, okay, everyone has to watch what I'm doing, because if I walk on water in Hyde Park, you better be there. So I was sharing all over my social media all of these epiphanies I was having. And one day at work, I ordered everyone champagne because I felt that I was a reincarnation of a sibling of mine who died from leukemia. And that was when my friends and family thought, what is going on? But that kind of kept going. And then it came to a head one day when the psychosis started. And that was like, okay, this is the day God's with me. And the world looked completely different to how I've ever seen it. Every single part of the English language was religious. Any sign, even like Tesco's or Sainsbury's, I'd be able to read into the reasoning of why it was called that to relate back to God. So it was a very weird day of psychosis, and that escalated to the point where I was actually in Stansted Airport going on holiday that day and lost all sense of reality and jumped through oversized baggage drop-off and then hit the fire alarm on my left-hand side and got arrested. And that day I could go into much more detail, but we don't have the time. But it was a very, very weird place. And so I've kind of taken you on that journey up to that point. That level of psychosis for me lasted about 2 months. And then 1 month after that, very, very high, but at least recognizing my parents. So those 2.5 months I was in hospital in Ealing. And yeah, those kind of delusions were beyond being able to talk about it. I thought I was Susan Boyle. I thought that I was directing everyone in Casualty on set. I just couldn't understand that I was in a hospital. And that was a real mixed state, because I'd have moments where I'd be really scared, because it's quite a traumatic environment, especially when other people around you are very ill. And then after that, finding my medication and bringing myself back down, I sunk into my biggest low episode I've ever had, which was about 8 months. And that was, I mean, the complete opposite. I was physically and mentally exhausted by what I'd been through. And I went into suicidal thoughts for about 8 months. And I just don't think that I could ever go that low or that high again. I think I really, when I got back to stability at the end of 2019, all I wanted was to be able to function in a more relative mood range, because I was quite scarred at both ends. But yeah, but that, I hope I've gone through the the waves.
Amazing
No, and
story,
thank you.
amazingly
Go on,
eloquent,
Nick.
and just so I've heard lots of stories, but it that was beautifully communicated, and I just think, wow, it is. And I think just the one thing I'd say, because James, I think you've got more to cover from your story over that, but the one thing I would say is that ultimately the one silver lining with most mental health problems, all these most common mental health problems, like I wouldn't necessarily put bipolar in that, but I'd include it, but is that they are generally completely reversible. So yes, you've gone through that incredibly challenging year or two, but actually, if you are able to use that experience to change your behavior going forward and hold yourself within the realms of functioning, then actually it's not like a lot of physical health problems where the problem persists, once you've gone through.
Yeah.
But so that is the one silver lining is that, and actually that's why people who are reflective and able to learn from their previous episodes, those are the ones who have the best outcomes. But sorry, James, I think you've got your
No, I
parallels with
think,
your stories with mania
yeah,
so similar, I think.
absolutely. And firstly, again, thank you, Rosie, for sharing and being open. It's great to have these conversations, and I can totally relate. And I think the thing that I didn't do as well as probably you did is understand that stability is where you want to be, and recognize that
It
where
took a
you
few
were.
years to get there,
Yeah,
I think. And
yeah,
I think that's a journey you continue to have, because I'm a 26-year-old who doesn't, my age, like getting high. And I
mm,
know my triggers now, and I know what gets me high. And about
mm,
every 3 weeks, I push the limit still. But
mm,
then I deal with the low because
mm.
I'm so sensitive. So yeah, even with caffeine, I know how to get high, so I just have to be really careful, because I'd love to sit here and say, I learn everything, but I just don't want that level of it.
Yeah.
But the hypermania, I'm like anyone else my age. There's parts of it which you will always chase, I think.
But I think that's it. Over the course of my 20s, I must have had 4 or 5 highs, because I kept thinking that I could control it. I kept thinking that actually I knew something that other people didn't. And
I feel like I have that every day
yeah,
still, which is why you've got to
there's
not.
pathways in your head that can lead you back down to those old thoughts. And it takes time to realize that those old thoughts actually don't enable you to have conversations like this, don't enable you to hold down a job, don't enable you to have relationships, etc. But I find, because when I go up, I have certainly after the first high, as you say, you don't know what is going on. From my perspective, I started taking a huge number of photographs. I started getting incredibly into photography, and then that got the photographs that I were taking were getting more and more abstract and starting to lose meaning. And then suddenly you're aware that actually you're sane in a one person world, but everyone else doesn't see you like that. And the problem is, and I think this is what I find so difficult, and the delusional thing is, in that moment things make so much sense, and so as a result, you're always trying to rationalize and trying to make sense of what is happening. And for
Yeah.
example, you take some time out, you go into the car. This was at the 21st when I was taking these photographs to try and get some space, and you you put the radio on and the first song you hear is "I Take Your Brain to Another Dimension, Play Close Attention." And the
It
problem is,
happens all the time. It
that
still happens.
and I've tried to work this out through the sort of repeated highs, because with those repeated highs over the sort of 20s, you have more awareness of what is happening. And how I've described it is, you create a construct of thoughts to make sense of your mind getting quicker and quicker and quicker. And you're therefore living in a world that's constructed of your own thoughts, where colors take on meaning, people take on meaning, synchronicities just become exponential until you find yourself almost synced up with time, with the TV, with whatever it is. And then you have the normal world, which we're talking in now. And I find that I'm dancing between these two worlds, but this world is just my thoughts. And the spiritual element is again something which has really landed with me, and it just gets so strange when you're up there. Time sort of disintegrates, and
I
it's a
find
very
now though that I can't block it out though. I
no.
think I don't know how I went 22 years of my life without thinking in a spiritual sense. It's just I can't go back to a normal day now without having that slight thing. But for me, what I've learned is like that might be called an intrusive thought. I think of it as my intrusive thoughts, where even with bipolar awareness, amongst young women, I'm on this mission and I have this purpose now. I would say my illness encourages me that's my
Well,
that's from God. This is
but
what my life is
that's
for. And then I have my rational brain where I think, well, you went through something really traumatic and it's not going to be a bad spend of your time if you help people. But I battle every day with this feeling that God is still acting through me, but in a normal pace of time, or whether it's a normal human reaction after going through that trauma to want to help people now that you've managed to get better because you're very privileged.
And I think the problem is that when you start thinking like this, I'd latch on to the fact, confirmation, that actually you are giving a message. What you were thinking back then was real. You were feeling that. And so then you try and always twist it back to the rationale that you had then. Nick, I don't know if you've any thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that when you are in that state of mind, that is your truth. There is that your experience is as true as anyone else's experience. It just happens to be different to everyone else's. And I think the other thing I would say in terms of how quickly people can get to that point of understanding or change their behaviors enough to be able to get stable and build their life back to normality is a lot to do with personality type. So it's not always in your control. Some people will have that ability to compartmentalize and be more structured and disciplined in the recovery than other people. So the example I always give is there was this amazing woman who was under my consultant's care a few years ago, and she had very severe type 1 bipolar, but she was very anti-medication. And I'm always careful with giving this example because I'm not advocating not doing medication, but she was someone who was so disciplined in her life in terms of the control she put, in terms of having caffeine, the structure she had in her life, the amount of sleep she took, the amount of early warning signs she would put in, so that she managed her bipolar purely through psychological and social interventions. And she has managed to do it for about 6 or 7 years. And I've never seen that done with people with other people before in such a disciplined way. The reason I've given an example to her is that she is 1 in 100. Most people do not behave like that, and I don't have the discipline to do that. So I, for example, really value my medication because but I'm just giving that in as just an interesting
I
example.
think that's super interesting. And I started off when I first got better, I was on lithium and quetiapine. So for anyone watching who doesn't know what those are, lithium is a mood stabilizer, quetiapine's the antipsychotic. The antipsychotic was what I noticed helped my depression, which was the thing I was really scared would never leave. And the lithium, for me, stopped that hypomanic state. And I decided at the end of 2022 that I would manage on one medication because the emotions and the love I feel in that slightly high state feels familiar to me. And my life without it didn't feel right. So I manage with very strict exercise, diet, not very much alcohol, and I'm on 400 milligrams of quetiapine, which isn't a lot. So I'd say that I do get depression and I do get highs, but it was something I was craving to have back, because being everything taken away at first, I needed those 2 years after hospital just to get my confidence back that I could have a day in my head. But yeah, after about 2 years, I craved that self-management. But I am so strict on it. So whenever a friend or someone I don't know asks me about lithium, I always say, you know, it's great if you want some stability. But I was very flat.
Yeah, that's
My
really interesting.
personality was not the
Yeah,
funnest, but you know, it wasn't the worst either. I was quite happy to go along with
yeah.
anything.
I'm just
Um,
gonna. I want to mention because happen to be on the same mix of medication. So I'm on lithium and quetiapine, and actually on venlafaxine for historical reasons. But I think
mm,
I just want to bring this in just in case anyone is listening and maybe some things that we're saying are chiming or something. But there is a big movement at the moment within, especially within the charity Bipolar UK, but across the country, to promote people to, if you're someone who is what we would call treatment resistant to depression, so you've tried a lot of the standard
mm.
SSRIs like citalopram, sertraline, whatever it might be, there is now a big movement to be like, actually, has this person got bipolar? Because normal antidepressants don't work very well on people with bipolar, and that means
Not a
that, and
single one worked on me. It's
yeah.
crazy. That's really interesting. And do you find on, because I did find, you know, I set up a company when I was on lithium, and there was a lot of creativity in that world, and I could get there. It just took a little bit longer, and sometimes, you know, you still will get that rush. And yeah, I think it's just saying it's not bad if you're on more medication, and I think it's just accepting that parts of your life, like if I went through a stressful time, I'd probably take it up again. I don't want to ever portray this thing that I got better and better and better, because I think the moment I accepted that bipolar was something I'd managed my whole life, that was when it became easier to manage. So right now I want to be on one, but if I went through a stressful period, I think it's accepting that you need help because you're dealing with something quite serious. So yeah, I would always encourage people to, in that moment, make a decision for what they need. And if stability is what you need, then that is really brilliant to be able to achieve that through any kind of combination.
Yeah, and
Completely
I
agree,
think,
and I can't believe how. Sorry, James, you go. Sorry.
no, I was just going to say, I think we're so fortunate to have access to that medication, and fortunately to respond to it. And I've often sort of just said, take your medication, but almost naively, to the extent that for some people they're going through a journey of discovering the right medication for them. And if anyone is watching and this is sort of bringing up any emotions, I think it's fair to say, Nick, that you'd agree that people do get there. You do get there. You do find the right medication for you, and
It's the
it's.
hardest journey though.
Well, I think
God.
again, it's everything's different for me. Within. I mean, if I start to come off my meds, and it's funny how that starts to happen. You don't, certainly throughout my 20s, I'd sort of miss a day, miss the odd day, and then you start to feel better. You start to get that focus. You start to sort of enter into hypomania, and you start to feel wonderful. And so it's a very addictive thing. And so you come off your meds more and more, and so then the world starts getting weirder and weirder and familiar, and you start connecting with things, and you start, in my case, teleporting yourself through the sun by staring at it and going blind, and your father collecting you from Bali. There's all these awful things that start to happen. But again, just going back to that story, at the time, it felt so right and so real, and inexplicable things happen for you to go and do that. But the point is, it's when the feeling of coming back down is a sort of, it's very strange. The mind slowing, this gradual slowing to then engage in this world. And I think that awful feeling of the mind being so quick, when you sleep, is to me the best barometer. Is when sleep starts to go, then you know that you've actually got to do something. But the scary thing is that you're aware of that, but you can't do anything, and
I
that's
also don't
thank
know what
goodness for medication.
I had an episode a few weeks ago where I was feeling super high. I ran a half marathon, and in my head, that was something I'd never be fit enough and mentally in the right headspace to ever do again, is spend that amount of time in my head. So it was this massive thing 5 years after my diagnosis to do. And when I stopped sleeping, I honestly thought, what is going to help? Because it's mad that someone with bipolar's ability to not sleep and function is also a thing. Like, I was on herbal sleeping pills, night nurse, microtypin, which used to knock me out within 5 minutes, and I was getting Zopiclone, and I still was struggling to sleep. And I thought the power of the mind and a good space of mind is like electric. It's the weirdest thing. I just lying there at night thinking, what? Come on, like some people take a little CBD drop and are like, boop, and then there's me like massively struggling on like 6 medications.
Yeah.
So
I think,
it's the hardest one to control, but it's it's the most important. But it can be frustrating when your body is out of sync with what your mind wants.
Yes, that's so true. That's so true. That way around is so true. And I think coming on to sleep and triggers, I mean, what are we aware of, Nick, with your own journey as well? What are we aware of what advice, but what could we offer to people listening of from our personal side of things, of what we start to notice starts to unfold, if you like, and what we can do to prevent that?
Yeah, and I think it is worth, I think it is worth saying that, when you are in that crisis point, and I think there's a lot of judgment one can put on oneself for not learning. For example, James and I know our own stories very well. It's taken us close to a decade, and you can look back at that and think, how has it taken that long? But I think it is just so insipid. The mind, your mind knows you best, and it can really get in to the cracks and find ways through. So I think the reason I'm saying that is that really the time to work is after. Often the motivation is very strong after the crisis, so you've just been through hell, whether it's on the depressive side or the manic side, and you're there and you're trying to think about how to rebuild. And I think, for me, the early signs, I keep a very close eye. Yeah, sleep is a good one for most people, but for me it's actually about putting in kind of check-ins with people I love, like just to really just say, it's not very frequently, but once a month, just to reflect, like, what's happened this month? Am I moving slightly one direction or slightly the other direction? So I think reflective practice, if done well, is amazing, and that is probably my number one kind of tool.
Yeah, and I think reflective practice, and actually, Diano, I just seen you've put in the chat, love the humor element in the discussion, and that's one of the ways that I try and get
That's
through
how
this
I have
is,
to deal with it. You either
yeah,
laugh,
you have to kind of, in the nicest possible way, from me, and this is from my own experience, so I feel I'm able to do that from a personal perspective, is to trivialize it, is to make it like not so scary. And so when you're waking up in the middle of the night thinking you're mad, and you turn the radio on and you're hearing a quote from Shakespeare about madness, rather than go, bloody hell, what the hell's going on here, just to be accepting of it and go, God, this is just weird, this is just weird and weird. And so although I might be able to do that, it took me a long time to realize that that's not how other people in my life feel. It's actually the total polar opposite. And so, when your mother shouts at you, don't you understand? That's the effing illness. You take a step back and go, oh, what illness? What have I done? And what harm have I caused my family? And that honestly took until early 30s to recognize, when my sister said, it destroys mum when you go up. I'm like, okay. And I should probably not do it for loved ones, if you like. And Nick, you've kind of mentioned that in the past as well, as the impact that this can have on families is very interesting.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to
No.
hear as well. I just wanted to add something on the humor point. It's very obvious I have bipolar now, because I'm mentioning that I also had a low a few days ago, and I've already said that this month I had a high. But on the low recently, I knew that I had to get myself out of it. And I've recently been in a relationship, only like the last 6 months, and I said to them, I need to be on my own. And whenever it happens, it takes me 2 days, 3 days. Like, I really have my tools I use to get out of that real freak out at first. And one of the things which helps me is when I'm completely alone and I feel so bad, I just honestly think this is actually ridiculous. Like, how can my mind be trying to crush me this much? Like, what have I done this week? Like, I really haven't gone and murdered anyone or whatever. So I don't know why I'm being so like attacked by my brain. And my humor always kicks in at my lowest point, and that's always when I start to be able to get out of it. And you don't imagine that moment ever happening in the first day. You're just tearful and like freaking out. And then for me, that's always been the point where I know that I'm not in an episode. I've been triggered to have a low. It's not going to be 6 months again. I'm not going to be trying to change my medication. I've just been triggered. So that, for me, humor's been a huge role. And even if it's just watching cartoons and thinking, I'm 26 and I'm having to lie flat and watch cartoons because I can't work today, I have to, I take myself out of the situation and kind of bird's eye view. It really helps me humor.
And but the problem with mania is if I'm watching cartoons, it's me in the cartoon. It's the
At the
cartoon is
high end as well, I can't
totally
entertain
talking
it.
to you, and so that's what gets very difficult. Is that it's that you become it becomes you, and your thoughts are being transcended live onto this thing. And I think I've the what happens is it just all these things confirm that your thinking is right, and fortunately for me, it's a delusion of grandeur. So I start to think similar to you, Rosie, that I am God. I'm God's dad. Like forget God, and so you go higher and higher. But then it can be flipped, whereby I've had moments, and this is what paranoia must be like. You have moments when actually all this amazing stuff is actually happening against you. So all these signs and all these things are actually to bring you down, and that's fear like I can't describe. And
The
it's
fear is horrible.
yeah.
Especially I always think, oh, I'm so lucky that I'm now 26 and I'm at an age where most people respect their friends when they have an opinion, no matter what it is. I'm not drinking tonight, guys. I need to go home. I need to look after myself. That fear at 22 where you just want to be like everyone else and you just want to do anything. And for me, having a trigger to go low feels similar to a panic attack in that I literally feel that I'm dropping and the ground is dropping, and I start thinking about the next day being in my head and how I'm not going to survive it, which obviously rationally is crazy. You're going to be fine, but that's how quickly my thoughts spiral. And I think that paranoia is just I really feel for people younger than me having to go through this without knowing their voice yet and speaking out, because ever since I've spoken out about my experience, I've met people like you. I've now got a friend, April. I've got a friend called Sam with bipolar, and I've created a network out of using my voice.
That's so good. And Nick, just Rosie touched on something there, which is sort of, I know that you've mentioned that, Rosie, you kind of implied that you were at that point, humor might kick in, and then you sort of recognize you're going to get out of your low. But Nick, you've mentioned to me that you kind of sort of look back and go, gosh, I'm out of it. It doesn't, from what with the conversations we have, it doesn't seem to be quite as one of those moments. I don't know if you want to describe, because I've seen you in a hypomanic state, that sort of that journey from being in a terrible place in going up. What was that like for you?
I think in hindsight, it feels like it happened very quickly, but actually, if you reflect on it, it's a much more gradual process for me, and it's obviously different for everyone. I mean, James, I've always been amazed at how responsive you are to medication. If you don't take your medication for a week, you'll be going up almost, not necessarily, but
Wow.
there's a good chance you will be. Whereas my the way in which my mood changes is more gradual. There was one thing, because I know we could talk for hours about this. I know we could. I think, James, is there like, should we keep going for another 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, I'm gonna I'm
Or
gonna I'm gonna I'm gonna I'm gonna turn us off at
yeah.
12:45 or so. So another
Okay,
5.
perfect.
Perfect.
Is that all right for you, Rosie? There was one thing
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really interested, Rosie, because I've never been admitted to hospital, so I don't know what it feels like directly. I've seen my mum admitted, and I've obviously worked on wards, and I've actually worked in Ealing as well at St Bernard's. I don't know where you were you.
I was in the
What,
Hope ward.
okay, yeah.
Top
So I know
floor,
it.
lots of hope here.
Yeah. So
But
it just
sadly, after
terrifies
lockdown,
me.
I'm not there anymore.
Um, I've referred a couple of times in a couple of podcasts I've done recently about the mum test and about what it feels like as a provider of care in the NHS, and not feeling like you would want to be providing this service to your mum or to a loved one. And just speaking to you today, it just made me feel like, gosh, what was that experience like for you? Because they're quite grim places, aren't they?
I think I've never been someone who, when people say they're like a princess and they need their things, I'm not really like that. And for me, it changed the way I see the world, because I was in there as the only middle class white woman who was sectioned within 5 minutes, because she definitely wasn't, actually trying to do something bad. She had a mental illness as soon as she broke the law. I don't know whether it's a law to shut down an airport, but I think for me, I was in there with people who genuinely were on their 3rd or 4th episode, never worked again, were unable to support their family, had their kids in care. There was so much violence. There was people really, that was their normal. And also, I think the girls my age, I think I had a real reality check, because none of them got better. Like, all the girls I know who are in there are still in the system. So for me, it was the most important thing to ever happen as someone who's like very privileged to be able to take a year living with my parents after to get better. Most people are paying rent, and so their first episode is the beginning of the end, and they forever can't get their job back. And yeah, the girl I was closest to, she was in her dream job working at Pret at Gatwick Airport, and then when she had her schizophrenic episode, she's never got better, and her mum had schizophrenia as well. So all of these stories and all of these people, I think that's my memory of it. I try not to think about how traumatic it was because I have a slight PTSD reaction every few weeks. I'll just feel really, really tearful and cry and have flashbacks because there was people trying to take their life and stuff in there. And when you're 22, you're just like, what is going on? But I would say the care, I think I've been very lucky because I've spoken to people who've not had this level of care. But in the one ward I was in, I was so nurtured by about 2 or 3 women who crossed that barrier of inpatient and would hug me. I was like desperately wanting my mum to be around, and obviously that couldn't happen. And they did go the extra mile and get me biscuits after midnight and hug me and sit in my bed with me. And I don't think that everyone gets that kind of treatment, especially when you're older. I think it was just because I was so young in there that people really caring for me felt that they wanted to mother me as well as get better. So I don't think that I'm quite aware that if I went when I was older, it would be a much worse experience.
That's certainly my experience of, there isn't the resource to provide that kind of care to everyone. So you kind of cherry pick, not in a kind of conscious way, but you'll have a few favorites, sadly, and they will get more support probably. It does happen like that, I think, in reality.
Yeah. But I do think like it was so in a way amazing because, and again, I have to be careful because of the stigma, what I say and what I don't say. But I thought in there, some of those people were the most interesting people I've ever met. And as a presenter, I think after this, I do find people like that more interesting than someone famous to interview, because I quite like that although you're in a state where you're ill, you're also in a natural state, and some of the beliefs people had and the feeling that they needed to change things, and even though it wasn't materializing for any of us, I've just never been so open to suddenly people saying what they really feel is happening. And all of us never talk about what we think the universe is, or everyone's talking about being a Taurus, but no one's talking about how our minds work and if there's a reason and all of that. So I just felt comfort because I'm very existential and I have quite interesting views on the world, and I actually felt okay, I feel slightly lucky to be around people who obviously battle with this difference. So that was a very long-winded answer, but I think all the time.
I don't know if this, I'm going to be careful what I say, but in terms of like just the, I've stepped back from doing clinical work for the last 6 months, and I just admit there's a melting pot of characters, like interest, people. There's just so I actually much prefer inpatient work, as much as it's traumatic some of the time, which is tough, but just the energy on the wards are quite extraordinary.
I mean, my favorite game was dancing to music videos on MTV, and the whole ward would get involved and they'd get angry at me for organising it. But I was like,
I think
what other place would everyone want to join in? Like,
I think
no one cares what's going on, and I just used to get so excited for it. I'd just sneakily get the remote and turn on MTV, and everyone would come in.
Brilliant. I think on that lighter note, then we'll leave with that, the idea of turning some music on, having a dance, and enjoying life. And to bring it back to the work that we're trying to do at Minderful, is we're trying to take this experience that we've got, both Nick and I, and of course other people within the team, and bring this idea of dancing, of engaging in the world, of trying to make the most of what's out there, and finding ways in which we can look after ourselves. So that's a nice sort of conclusion to it all. But Rosie, thank you so much. I mean, what a powerful 45 minutes or so. I feel I've learned much more about you than when we first met. So more stories to come. And I think there's so many stories, and so many amazing stories that will be spread today on World Bipolar Day. We're certainly not the only ones doing this, and I think it would be a fascinating reflection tomorrow to look back over what everyone said. And Nick, as ever, your experience is wonderful. So thanks so much.
Please do keep in contact, because I think we said this, James, when we met as well, is like when I speak to other people who know that the emotions I go through, you do get this excitement because it barely ever happens that you feel other people know how you feel. Like that's a real special moment for me because your mind will always try and convince you otherwise at either end.
It's also very grounding because you realize that actually you're not alone. You're not sort of Mr. God. You know, there's other people who've been through it. Anyhow,
absolutely. I'd love to keep the conversation going, Rosie. I've been so impressed with how you understand your illness. It's amazing.
Oh, that's very sweet of you.
Yeah.
Still some bits I just think, what the hell? No, not yet. But we're getting there.
All in time.
Okay,
thank you everyone.
Thanks to everyone who's listening.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.